But a lot of the countries have heritage that is worth maintaining and having pride in. But for sure, it's about looking at the future. Well, a lot of times it is that protectionism, and you'll have this contradictory situation very often where a government will accept they need FDI and they'll put it as a major objective to attract FDI.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Alchemy of Transformation, where we will discuss in depth the essence of things and how do things transform, whether it is the self, the person, the organization, or the venture, or the society. In this episode, we will discuss a very important topic for a lot of countries: attracting foreign direct investment, because investment is critical, whether you are in China or in Chile or South Korea or India, in terms of transforming the economies from being underperforming to becoming manufacturing hubs, exporting hubs. But FDI is complex, it's not easy. Lots of countries try to do it, but not many achieve to do it. In order for us to understand it, we have someone who's a researcher, someone who is a thinker, someone who has been an editor, a reporter on FDI for the last more than 20 years. And now she's a practitioner. She's a founder of a company that sole purpose is for countries to attract FDI, both for ministries, for cities, as well as for countries. So with us, we have the founder, the former editor of FDI magazine, which was published by the Financial Times, and now the founder of her own venture in this very unique space. It's also called FDI, called Fingar Direct Investing. Welcome to the podcast, Courtney. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on this podcast. It's great to be here. Well, yes, as you mentioned, we met quite some time ago in London, and London is where I'm based now. I came to the UK around 23 years ago, originally to do a master's degree at the very beautiful University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Before that, I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, in the southern United States, and Birmingham has itself quite an interesting FDI story, like the state of Alabama, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that. But I grew up there. I did not travel very much, had a quite normal childhood living in the suburbs there. It's a place where people don't travel a huge amount. I wouldn't say it's terribly cosmopolitan or very international, but for some reason I was fascinated and fixated on the idea of international travel. So I was always kind of in my room fantasizing about seeing the world. And I'm very lucky that a career in FDI, and in particular in international business journalism, really gave me the avenue to do that. It's one of the reasons that I love FDI. I love the ability to travel, experience, and see new places, and interact with people from all corners of the globe. So Edinburgh was really a way, I guess, to get me into the world, to give me an education, to get me into the UK, where I really wanted to be. To come in on a student visa was a way to do that. I was very lucky that I got a job after that degree in London, which was actually not so easy for visa reasons, which many people will relate to, and the need for a work permit. But I was quite fortunate to get a job at a small publishing company called the ARC Group. And I was given the responsibility of editing a magazine on trade finance, which I actually knew nothing about. And this was before Google was ubiquitous. So it was not so easy to learn very quickly about something you know nothing about. I also didn't know how to run a magazine on my own. So it was a real crash course in everything, but a really foundational experience. After 2 years, the Financial Times actually approached me as they had launched. I had done some freelancing in the past during my time at Edinburgh, and they had newly launched a magazine called FDI Magazine, and they were looking for someone to take it over and be the full-time editor. And it was really something of a dream job to work as a journalist for a publication, or a media group rather, like the Financial Times, but also in a topic like FDI being in the division of FT that I was in, we had a lot of autonomy. We weren't on the newspaper. We were running our own magazines. And it was really quite a special time. And I did that for 15 years. The magazine grew enormously. We acquired data businesses, and that's what it developed during that time into what is now FDI Intelligence, which is quite, I guess, a force to be reckoned with in the world of FDI. So we evolved a lot into data journalism, and that meant I had to evolve into a data journalist. And yeah, I guess there's a lot to say about that time period, but that allowed me to learn a lot about FDI, to become increasingly passionate about it, to become an expert in the topic. And now I've segued from only partly out of journalism, because I still do various media work, but I'm now a practitioner and doing FDI consulting, which I'm finding fun because I can now be more at the sharp end of things. And that's a sort of very rapid fire summary of where we are now. So be happy to jump off into any direction that you find interesting in that.
And certainly feel that you have changed gears ever since you have set up your own entity, because I certainly have felt that your LinkedIn profile has been much more active and
Yes,
much more
that's true.
exciting and interesting.
That's
Because of course you're attending your own boss, your own schedule, you do the things that you're interested in. And how's that coming along?
Well, it's good. And yes, I'm quite a hyperactive LinkedIn poster now. That's partly because I've learned the advantages of that. But when you work for yourself, it's really important as a means to show people how things are evolving, what activities you're doing, what services you're offering. And to be honest, I would say 99% of the work that comes my way comes either from a prior relationship that
Wow.
I had, or someone sliding into my DMs, as they say in LinkedIn. So it is effective, but I want people to understand that how things are transitioning for me, and it's a good way to promote the media work that I still do, but also to show what I'm up to these days. And as you've seen, I attend a lot of events, usually in a capacity as a moderator. And that is something that I did throughout my time at FT, but I'm now doing in an independent professional capacity. I get hired to moderate panels or to chair investment forums, but also to advise on content of events like that. So events are a major strand of my business, and I love that because I have a lot of experience in it. But that keeps me out there. It keeps me learning. It keeps me networking, meeting new people, refreshing connections with existing contacts. So that's why some people joke and say, "Weren't you just posting yesterday from Dubai, and now you're in China? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, that's the event circuit. That's the FDI circuit, and that's just the way it goes, particularly at certain times of the year."
Excellent, and certainly you're doing a good job, and it's working, and that's why we are here, because I saw that you are doing exciting work, and it's a great way to project. I'm a big fan of it, and I'm a big fan of personal branding
Mhm.
and projecting your work and learning through sharing. So I think that's fantastic that you're doing it, and I think let's delve back into the past. And we have one thing else in common other than we meeting in London, is that actually I've been to Birmingham, Alabama. I have been there. One of the very few people, as you can imagine. And I've been to the airport, and also one of the very fancy shopping malls there. It was a very fancy shopping mall in Birmingham. But my sister used to work not far from them in Lucedale, Mississippi, and Columbus, Mississippi. So sometimes you have to catch the plane from Birmingham, Alabama.
That's
So
right.
how was it growing up with a very rich, very historical history, culture, in a way, it's your own world. It's very green. It's actually the part of the world is very beautiful, very green, but also very insular. So how was it growing up in that kind of community? Was it your urging to break free, to go out, that took you out to London and then to do FDI? And how does your upbringing or your experiences made you who you are today?
Well, it's a good question, and a complicated question. And you're right,
Yes.
first of all, about the shopping malls. We love our shopping in Birmingham, Alabama, and I still love shop when I go back home.
Yeah.
Um, it's a nice place, and I always feel a little bit guilty when I talk about how desperately I wanted to leave there. But I think a lot of people probably have complicated feelings about the place that they come from, and I do. People are overall kind and friendly. This is something that I miss very much. This inherent friendliness. I always have to zip myself up a bit in London, whereas the Alabamian in me wants to talk to everyone on the train and in the elevator. So there are wonderful places about it. But it is insular, as you said. And I struggled a lot because I did feel I wanted to break free. I felt a bit trapped. Then I felt guilty for feeling that way.
Mm.
And a difficulty was that with it being a fairly insular place, and again, there was internet then, but it wasn't so easy back then to make connections outside your circle. I didn't really have a template for how to break out. The expectations. I was a very good student, a nerd, if I'm honest. So it was clear that I would have options because I was making good grades. I was succeeding, but the expectations were more that you get a good job in Birmingham, maybe Atlanta. And I was trying to think beyond that, but I didn't have a template for what that might look like or how to do that. And again, I felt this sense of guilt, like why wouldn't that be good enough for me? Who do I think I am with these pretensions of wanting to live in London and travel the world? So I struggled with that, if I'm honest. And then I went to university at the University of Alabama, which I loved. I remain a very proud alum of that really wonderful university. I remain an obsessive fan of our football team, but I won't get
Oh,
into that.
wow.
There's a lot of pride in my roots. But as I was completing that, I was looking at my options, and again, the options just seemed to be moving maybe at a city somewhere nearby. And I just thought, no, I need to just run away from home, as it were. And I found out about a program called BUNAC, and I forget what this acronym actually stands for. But essentially, they could give you a 6-month work permit in the UK if you were a recent graduate of a US university. And I don't even remember how I found out about it again because I wasn't using the internet much. So I found out about that. I applied in secret. So I essentially hatched a secret plan to run away from home. And the reason it was secret is I didn't want people bothering me. I didn't want the pressure to conform. And bearing in mind that it's also a conservative place. So the ideas of, especially back then, what
Back
women
then, yes.
should and shouldn't be doing, what their
Mm.
lives should and shouldn't look like were fairly restrictive. I was under pressure to, marry the boy next door and just get on with a very conventional life. So I plotted my escape in secret. I saved up money. I had scholarships, but I took extra jobs. I felt I got a passport secretly, like it was a naughty thing to do. Um, I booked a flight. I made my plan. One night over margaritas, I confessed to 2 friends my plan, and they said, "Oh, we would like to come with you." So 3 Alabama girls went off to
Oh,
London
wow.
without a clue of what to do when we arrived here.
What an adventure.
It was an adventure. It was an amazing adventure. I'm still friends with both. We laugh a lot about how stupid we were, how clueless, because not only we didn't know anything about the UK, but we weren't even used to being in big cities. So I remember even things like waking up and hearing footsteps going past the window was weird to me, because in Alabama, if someone's walking past your window, they're probably a burglar. So you've got a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
So
Or an animal, or some kind of an animal
yeah,
that's
something's
roaming
going
around.
wrong if they're
There's a lot of.
it was all overwhelming. We didn't know how to use the subway. It was hilarious, but exhilarating, absolutely exhilarating. And I think actually because there wasn't social media, there was email, but it was a new thing. You really could just disappear in a really wonderful way. So I could separate myself a bit from, I guess, the vortex that I called it that might have pulled me back into my
Safe
original
zone.
environment, could just be
Yes, yes.
free. It was
Ah,
amazing. I managed to last 8 months, but the visa ran out, the ability to work ran out, therefore money ran out. I then moved to Washington because I thought I don't want to just go back to my hometown after having broken out and seen something else. I moved to Washington because that's a really great place for journalists to work. I mean, you have every
mm,
media outlet pretty much in the world there. That was a good move in the end. I worked for first for a media group that covered called National Journal Group that covered politics. I then got a job at a magazine called Global Business, and that's really what got me into what would lead to FDI because this magazine was written for US executives to tell them about opportunities outside the US. So I started going on my first international business trips. I love the topic. I found I was quite conversant in it, good at it. But I was pulling, how do I get back? The UK was still pulling me in my mind. How do I get back there? And I decided master's degree, student visa, that's my return. And as I mentioned, that's what I did. Edinburgh, studied international politics, but with a focus on political economy. And having a degree in journalism and political economy and politics, this turns out to be a great combo for FDI, in fact. And then so I did do that degree, and then the rest is history, as it were.
so do you think there's the pull of providence in all of this, looking back at your life, as Steve Jobs used to say, that life makes sense when you look back, not looking
Kind of.
forward?
Kind of, because there's always some combination of luck, some fortuitous things happen, but you also make your own luck. And I was a very determined character ever since I was a child. But I can't see, I do feel in a way, not to be cheesy, I was destined for this life. I was destined
Mm.
to work in this field. So I can't quite imagine it having worked out any other way, although there were a lot of setbacks on the way. And there were a lot of points where it looked like I wouldn't get away with this plan. But it does feel a bit meant to be. I can't quite imagine my life any other way.
And I've been there and I've seen the houses in the Alabama area. They're beautiful old houses,
Yeah.
very, very large houses. So coming to London would have been a cultural shock, I can
Oh,
imagine.
absolutely.
But you talked about this guilt about leaving behind something and embracing something new. This is something which is very common, but I think less so in America because most people are immigrating there, and
Mhm.
then rather than the other way, the journey you've taken. But I think most immigrants, people, myself and others, have, in order for an adventure, better life, have to leave their old towns behind,
Yeah.
and then go on. But in a way, sometimes their towns also change, and
Yes.
so they have become a different person. The town has become a different person, so it's very difficult for you to go back. So do you see that that has also happened in your case, that you've moved on, but your city has moved on, and now it's difficult for you to ever move back again?
Yes to both of those. Although I would say that my town has moved on in a lot of really good ways. There's been very
Yeah,
good city leadership, in particular in
yeah.
recent years. So
Mm.
there are areas, for example, in the downtown that once were maybe no-go areas that have been sort of rehabilitated, are now thriving. It's a better city than it used to be. It's a better run city than it used to be. And obviously, Birmingham and Alabama in general has a very complex and not entirely pleasant history. It was the sort of hub of the civil rights movement, and a lot of strife, a lot of terrible things happen there. Race relations have always been difficult, although I see progress there too. Not entirely enough, but I see progress. So you know, the place evolves itself just as I evolve by leaving. What I would say though is I don't necessarily feel a disconnect. So because my main family is still there, my parents, my siblings, sisters-in-law, and beloved nieces and nephews. So although
Uh-huh.
I left, I don't get back very often. those ties are still very strong. I'm a very family-centric person despite living far away. So it's not that I just left the place behind, because those family bonds remain, which are the most important bonds really in life. And also, again, the place has evolved. I see a different city when I come back. I go to cool, interesting areas that maybe
Yes.
I wouldn't have gone to in the past. And I actually enjoy that. That said, could I see myself living there again? Probably not. Too many things have moved on. I've found that I'm a big city person. So I probably wouldn't move back, but it will always be part of me. It will always be an important part of my life, especially because the people that I love most in the world are there.
We will return back to this theme of leaving behind for something good, greater, because that is in a sense a lot of countries have to go through.
Mhm.
Leave behind their old culture, their
Yes.
identity in order to attract new investment, new FDI to be a different way. So, in a way, that is kind of reflected in the work that you do, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the later part. So, tell us about so once you ended up in Edinburgh, which is a beautiful city, a
Mhm.
very historical city, but a small city,
Yeah.
also culturally very diverse city, but a historical city. So, how was it adjusting into both university life and soon afterwards? What are the challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome it?
Well, as you mentioned, Edinburgh is a staggeringly beautiful city. I was just completely enchanted the first time I saw it, and I remained so. I went back to Edinburgh only 2 weeks ago, and it really takes my breath away every time I see it. It's magical and beautiful. So I'm really pleased with my choice. It's a good university. It was the right choice, but it was an exceptionally difficult year, mainly because, as is the case with many students, I was so broke every day. I really had no business being there. I could not afford to be there. I took an enormous student loan. I was working at a pizza shop. I remember that I lived on 60 pounds a week. And then you have that awful feeling by Wednesday, you've like, I've spent 40 pounds and now I can't eat. So I found it very difficult, and there was a clock ticking over my head because it was a gamble. It was a financial gamble to go there, to take on debt, to not just get a job, to sort of take a financial hit in the hope that it would lead to something, but not knowing whether it would. So this clock was ticking over my head the whole time. Would this all have been for nothing? So, although I'm pleased with my experience, it's a great university. I made really wonderful friends there who I still hold very dear, but it was not the easiest year of my life by any means.
And then transitioning into London from there onwards, how was that into a job? What are the expectations? And it seems you've always done entrepreneurial. So although you've been an employee, but you've always done entrepreneurial roles either in small organizations where you have to do multiple things, or as part of new startups like the FDI magazines. So how
Mhm.
was it settling into corporate and working life in London?
Well, actually, that's a very good point. You're quite right. There's probably an entrepreneurial spirit in me. So I do like launching and building things. At first, first of all, I was euphoric, that my Edinburgh gamble paid off, that I got the job, I got the work permit, and it was down to the wire. I was probably days from being deported when I actually got a job. So I remember practically skipping down the street in London saying, I did work. But, then, it was a small company. The pay was not great, as media tends not to be. London is shockingly expensive, as
Right.
you know, and who almost anybody probably knows. So that was an adjustment, but it was still easier than the student budget. So by contrast, I was delighted to just be working, to be earning something, to be working in London, to be working in journalism. So I think gratitude's important. And although it wasn't the easiest role, I was kind of in over my head. I mostly remember that time period of feeling quite grateful that I was getting to do what I had set out to do. Um, that said, when FT came along, that job is the job that I consider the breakthrough, because as you rightly pointed out, it was another opportunity. It was to build something new, but within a very established company with
Hmm.
brand kudos, which helps a lot, with the credibility that helps a lot. but still building something. And again, I remember feeling so grateful, so excited. Some days I couldn't believe that it was life, that, I could travel almost anywhere I wanted because everywhere is an FDI story. So the fact that I could gallivant around the world doing interesting things, meeting interesting people, um, was kind of unbelievable to me. And I think coming from where I came from, I appreciated these things so deeply. Of course, it has its challenges. Working life always does. You worked very hard, put a lot into it. Um, but the main feeling is kind of gratitude of the things that I had, especially in those early years.
And then, so there you were from Alabama, free spirited, and so how did you adjust to a so publishing? I know for a fact is highly competitive.
Mhm.
Journalism is highly competitive. Pay is not that great at the early starting stage.
Right.
My friends did that, and most of the people end up doing it for free because they are very passionate about doing
Yeah.
those things. So, but then you were part of a big enterprise, which is FT, with some politics, with some kind of underlying ideology people have. How did you manage that coming from where you come, which is quite straight, quite friendly, kind of southern part of the US?
Well, it's a tricky one, and I'll try to be candid yet diplomatic. There were cultural differences, I found class is so prevalent in the UK in a way that still shocks me after 23 years. I always say that British people wear their class like a coat that they can't quite take off. Publishing, as you mentioned, is competitive. Um, it's challenging, but because the pay is bad, is what I call a high prestige, low pay industry. Very often, a lot of people that come into it have come from privileged backgrounds because they can sort of afford to just live on the prestige. So it creates class difficulties, even I would say in a workplace. I remember being quite shocked, if I'm completely honest, how some people, by virtue of being from a certain background, being male, knowing the right people, seemed like they could coast along. And as an American, it kind of outraged me. And as an American, I would be very vocal about these things. So these are things that I found challenging. Again, I have to caveat all that by saying that I loved the job. It was a great place to work for a very long time. But these are things that cut into the culture of publishing in London, but that cut into the culture of the UK that maybe were a bit jarring for me. I'm also very blunt being an American, so I always said it's a little bit like the fable of the emperor's got no clothes. I was the one always shouting that there were no clothes. Make things a little bit
Yeah.
difficult sometimes.
So very interesting because I think publishing and media is a very legacy industry in UK.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
probably those class, hierarchies or systems exist. I was in an investment bank, and because investment banks were Americanized way back in 80s and 90s, we had much less of that. I would imagine that at the top ranks of the society of the organization, there was less of that, but there was much more of it. But at least in the middle rungs of the, it was very much meritocratic and hardworking, and you came from whatever different backgrounds because it was Americanized. And so law also Americanized in a sense the law profession in the UK in 1990s. You think that media journalism and publishing has Americanized in UK in the last 20 years since you've been there?
I would say, if thinking about it, probably not at the pace of other industries, including, I don't have direct experience in the ones that you cited. But I would say it could maybe do with a little bit more of that. I have mixed feelings about media because I've always loved it. I built my career in it and have loved it. And again, I feel deeply honored to, especially have worked for one of the world's most elite media organizations. But media is very challenging now, I think, because of the issues, the pay differentials, actually, especially between the journalist and commercial side, that tension, the tightrope you always have to walk, which is one of the challenges I faced between the commercial realities, but maintaining your journalistic integrity. It's very difficult. So this is something that's challenging with media. And then, of course, AI is challenging things, is changing the landscape. Social media, there's more independent media. Kind of almost anyone can be a commentator, or if not an outright journalist, can be a writer, can get their voice out there. And so it's challenging traditional media as to what the role actually is, what's the framework. I feel very passionate that there's great value in the integrity of what's sort of dismissively called the mainstream media, but it is the mainstream media for a reason. And one thing that I think people talk a lot about media bias, but they probably don't understand actually in mainstream media the structures that are in place, the seriousness with which we would take the responsibility over what we published, even legally. We all have to have media training. You can't just come out and say anything and write anything reckless. And what I think we're losing is that those guardrails that traditional media has that are actually very
Mm.
important, they don't exist in social media and the blogosphere, but people are now equating the two. And that's how we're getting a culture of disinformation. It doesn't mean that mainstream media never makes mistakes, but they try really hard to get things right. Whereas now we have an environment where you could post anything, write anything. And that kind of is a threat to traditional media, but I think is a threat more generally because of the disinformation climate that it creates. That's probably a topic of a whole other podcast.
Yeah, oh Lord.
Feel
No,
that.
but it's a very interesting area because it also talks about the consumption of information by people
Mhm.
and what sells and how do you make things you know, commercially viable but also objective. But I think that the way we have what you call the Big Bang, which happened in 1980s, which is Margaret Thatcher. A lot of investment banks came, and then as a result salaries in city went up, and but the legal profession was protected. It was still very cozy, very cushy, low
Yeah,
salaries, entry point, you work your way up, the partners was very exclusive. But then the Americans came, the law firms came, Americans, and they literally doubled the salaries at the base of the
right.
of it, and at the base entry level, and the whole and hard working, long hours, much more egalitarian and meritocratic. So in
Yeah.
that sense, the Americanization of these industries has been good and made
Mhm.
things more competitive. Of
Yeah.
course, media is I do see anywhere in the world there is a tension between the editorial desk and the commercial side of the business.
Yes.
And there was a time when Catherine Graham at the Washington Post would be, reviewing these things and making sure things were done to the right journalistic standards.
Yeah.
That's not there anymore. That's definitely gone.
Yes. Some of those walls are breaking down, and it's always very, very difficult because you need, if you can't make money, then there's no publication, but you just have to tread that line very carefully.
Yeah.
There's real scope and utility actually in sponsorship, because it does give an opportunity for companies, but in the world of FDI, companies, locations, development agencies, to tell their story in a useful, if controlled way. So I was never an editor that sneered at the advertising. In fact, we welcome it, because that is a way, especially in the world of FDI, for investment promotion agencies to work productively with the media and to get their story out there. It's like most things, it's all about finding the right balance.
Absolutely. You have to realize it's a way to measure. It's one of the measures that you're adding value. And what you're
Yes.
doing is valuable somewhere that they're willing to pay. That's not everything, but that's certainly one of the things. So tell
Yes.
us about your corporate venture, the FDI magazine. What were the challenges trying to set up a new publication within a probably a bureaucratic, a large organization? How did you build the team? Smart people, manage them, and manage to grow it over a period of time?
Well, I think that one of the challenges was what we just spoke about. Again, how do you make sure that your editorial is credible and useful for your readers? while being commercially viable, as especially when a publication is relatively new. That's very important. I feel that the success of the publication means that we managed to do that well. Um, I think there are challenges, again, of being almost, our division felt, yeah, sort of like a startup hub. And we were within a bigger organization. So sometimes you have different cultures, but at the same time, being within such a large, powerful, important, well respected organization was extremely helpful to the early years, especially of FDI Magazine, because it wasn't just coming out saying, oh, here's this new publication, you don't know who we are. There was this credibility that it was launched by a very serious media organization. Um, but we also tread a lot of lines. We never wanted to be trading too much. We were operating separately from the newspaper, and people would conflate the two in ways that were not quite accurate and not always helpful. So we always would try to be very clear. Yes, we're part of this group, and it's great that we're part of this group, but we're our own little silo in a way, and people would confuse the two. And throughout the time period, and I'm sure it exists to this day, we would publish rankings that would be from our FDI magazine, and then the prime minister of whatever country's gone on his local media and said Financial Times has declared us the best place to invest in the world, whereas maybe we had done a statistical analysis and published our own rankings. So those were kind of, I guess, endless balancing acts that we had to do. I think the real breakthrough was in 2008 when we purchased what was at the time the Loco. We didn't purchase the consulting division, but had been launched a set of data products by consulting company in Belfast. And that really helped give a new offer, give more grounding to what we were doing, because we had our own data tracking FDI, which we could then use for editorial. It gave more weight to our rankings, but it also grew the team, grew the business. So I think that was kind of the critical moment. But also it meant that we all had to learn new skills. Again, we had to become more data savvy as journalists. We had to learn to tell stories through data. But that was kind of an exciting time, because it did mean that the business was developing, growing in headcount, but also in its offerings. And then it had, it's kind of in those years since continued to grow even further.
So this is a very good segue into the discussion around FDI, because it tells you an evolution of selling the FDI story from, to a data-driven, database story. So how much, historically trade data has been much more widely accessible, available, and that's how most of the international economic analysis is based on that. So FDI is something which is new. Did you find it difficult to get hold of FDI data from different countries? Most countries are quite, cagey. They don't want to share it.
Yeah.
Did you have easy? It was easy. It was difficult. And then tell us about data products that you're able to make, or you were able to make. And then were you able to monetize them? Is it difficult to monetize data products around FDI? So that aspect of the work that you did.
Well, the data around FDI is often very murky, and that remains the case. And one of the difficulties with FDI is the measures are different based on who's measuring it. Also, the classifications get complicated. So are we talking about what are kind of headline FDI flows that could include M&A and portfolio investments? So some people will cite that number. Purists, and I would probably say I'm a Greenfield FDI purist, will say that Greenfield FDI is probably the purest measure, because this is the real FDI, the productive FDI that's creating jobs, that entails a physical footprint. But people tend to conflate these different measurements, and then so you're comparing apples to oranges, for example. And of course, governments announce their own FDI figures. We don't always know how accurate those are. That's why I think it's important. There are two things to realize. One is that we can never be 100% sure
Yes.
about FDI data.
Yeah.
I always say it's like capturing grains of sand in your hand. You can never track all of it. You can never capture all of it. The best you can do is have as solid of a bowl as you can to capture as many grains of sand as possible, right? And then be able to analyze them. And I think having these data products that were developed, I should state, I did not develop them. I was just the kind of editorial person interpreting and telling stories with it. What is now the FDI markets database is one of those that is tracking only greenfield FDI. And again, that's very useful because it's something as a measure that you can look to and that is real. We also pioneered one later at a company that I worked for called Global Data. They also have a database that was pioneered by some of the people that had worked on the FDI markets database that's also capturing greenfield FDI. So I think there's a utility in these data products because also you can purchase this data, you can use it, you can make sense of it. They're very clear methodologies, so you know what it is you're getting. The only downside is, of course, they're limited because it leaves out that bigger picture of other types of investment. So it's a good measure and a fairly clear measure of one aspect, which I would consider the core of FDI. But very often you want a bigger picture. And actually, these days, there's an increasing focus by investment promotion agencies on institutional investment, driving investment into PPPs, but also VC investment and PE investment. So there's a need for other data sets that investment promotion agencies can use that can track that type of investment. So the best you can do is almost piecing all these things together. So considering what do we think is the best source of maybe greenfield data, then what's the best source of data on M&A? What's the best source on VC and PE? And how can we then take those data sets and use them in a smart way? But there's very little that's completely comprehensive. And again, it can never be 100% accurate because I believe that is in fact impossible.
And so, for the benefit of the audience, in your view, in your considered opinion, which is the most credible when you look at Greenfield or M&A or VC or private equity in terms of FDI? If one was to get for Pakistan or for Indonesia as much of a full view of FDI, what different kind of databases or information you'd tap?
Well, I have to say I'm less expert on, for example, the VC data. I mean, the best overarching source of data, I guess at the broad level, would be UNCTAD, so UN Trade and Development, because what they do is they will take sources like FDI markets for the greenfield data, but they will reinterrogate it themselves. But they also will look at M&A data. They look at investment into infrastructure. They look at investment into the Sustainable Development Goals. So their annual World Investment Report that brings all those pieces together, but the data is also available for download on their website, I think is the kind of best guide overall to get the fairest picture of what's happening. When you get into there's some good data sets, like there are interesting data sets of rising unicorns, for example. That's pretty cool data. If you're a location trying to attract tech companies, that you may want to look at things like that. You've got PitchBook and other kinds of sources that are good at tracking companies and on the VC side. But I would say I can provide a better sense of the offerings on the strictly FDI data.
FDI side. Okay, great. And so tell us about your most favorite FDI story. Now we're not still in the venture, your personal venture space, but before then, the FDI story that really got you excited, that really made you think that this is where you want to dedicate the rest of your professional life to. What was it exciting about that story? What was difficult? What was challenging? And what was the end conclusion?
Well, the one that stands out the most to me is post-war Iraq. So I
Oh,
did
wow.
I had an opportunity beginning in 2009 to go sort of I was invited by the US Marines to come and look at the story of economic reconstruction. And I ended up over a 2-year time period going 4 or 5 times, and I got really quite invested in the story because it mattered, it was important, it was very intense, it was exciting. You almost feel a bit guilty for having the adrenaline. No one wants to be a war vulture, but there is an adrenaline of being in a conflict zone. But also it just mattered a lot. There were kind of in a race against time to, for example, create jobs faster than Al Qaeda could recruit disaffected young men, for example.
Very
And
good. Yes, yes,
and I
yes.
remember spending quite a bit of time with the governor at the time of Al Anbar province, and that's what he was saying. You know, I'm in a race. Can I create jobs or stabilize my province's economy faster than terror groups can recruit? So I was very engaged in this story at the time because it was so important. It mattered a lot. It was exciting and interesting, but it felt very, very, very urgent and important. And also it was clearly something different for a business journalist. You know, I was used to kind of swanning around in hotel ballrooms listening to presentations and spending time in offices. I was not used to being in a flak jacket, flying around in a helicopter. And I can't deny that I found that exciting. But again, then you have these conflicted feelings, like I just don't, you know, it seems exciting to me because I'm just sort of parachuting in, to use a bad metaphor, but for other people that were living sort of with the consequences of the conflict, that whose lives were kind of at risk daily, you're sort of like, maybe I'm having too much fun in this environment. So it's a very, again, it was a complicated time, but for sure it was the standout for me in my career, in terms of, I also liked the reporting that I did. I'm proud of it. I feel I told the story well. It felt important. It felt urgent. But ultimately I would put it, I always say as well that Iraq broke my heart, because you know, ultimately we failed in a way. There were a lot of people engaged in at a lot of levels, and in those years, this was 2009 to 11, trying to get Iraq back on its feet, trying to create some economic stability that could then create maybe political stability and enhance the security. But this sort of ISIS coming in and taking over large swathes of Iraq meant that that was ultimately a failure. So it was quite, I was emotionally engaged in that story, in that situation. And I remember my blood running cold when I read that that Ramadi, the capital of Al Anbar province, had fallen to ISIS. You know, it felt kind of personal to me.
You know, I think what you said is very interesting. Because one of my stints, I was at the Kennedy School of Government,
Mhm.
and so a lot of development practitioners who worked with me, and some of them I asked them later on, which is the best, which is the most impactful experience they would ever go back to, and a lot of them said they would love to go back to Kabul. And
Mm.
they said that the kind of work that we're doing, it was very urgent, very impactful. You're kind of in a bubble because you are, and everyone, it's an acquired taste. Not everyone will end up in Kabul or in Fallujah or in Ramadi. It has to be a certain kind of a person.
Yeah.
And when all those people get together in a place and working together, it creates a special kind of energy bond and feeling. So it's very interesting that you say that, because that's exactly what they said. They said, it
Yeah.
was like difficult time, but it was crazy time, and we cannot explain the feeling that we had. Number one.
That's
Number two, I think is Fallujah, Ramadi. I think they're all in Al Anbar province. So,
right.
and these are the things you hear about it in a violence context, but to talk
Yeah.
about it in a reconstruction thing was very interesting, and in a way, what you call nation building, whatever emotion you may have about that term, is a lot to do with the work that you were doing. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the term they were using was economic, in some cases, economic reconstruction, but also economic counterterrorism. Again,
Mm.
which is, can we create stability? Can we give people something else to build their lives around, so they wouldn't be susceptible to joining radical groups, for example. And I think that that was clearly desperately important and remains so in a lot of places around the world. But it didn't. it shows the importance of FDI and what it can do because it is part of that rebuilding after a conflict. In that case, there was a lot of progress, but certainly a failure, which was quite heartbreaking in a way. Now Iraq is coming back. I'm
It
actually
is coming
very
back.
to
Yes.
go
Yes.
keen to go again, but there were some incredibly dark days, in the post-war, but there was the feeling at one point of optimism, and that optimism just got completely smashed, but now the optimism's back. But it's clear that FDI has a role to play in sort of any unstable place in the world because of what it can deliver in the way of skills, technology, jobs, and ultimately, if channeled properly, economic stability.
No, absolutely. So one thing is Iraq is coming back, and I know stories about people migrating to them for work, for labor, and all of those things. So that is definitely happening. Um, my and the other thing was fascinating is of all the places, Iraq was in a way cradle of civilization.
Mhm.
Babylon, the Euphrates, and everything. A lot of these, ancient things happened there. So to see it in the current state is also
Yeah,
painful, but
it
also to
is.
know that the Iraqi people are quite talented. They're very well educated. Historically, they're very well educated. They have the
Yes,
DNA that you can do something that they can help build their own
absolutely,
country. They are
absolutely,
nationalistic as well. So there's something to work with. Did
absolutely.
you feel that the same way about the quality of talent, the culture in Iraq?
Absolutely, and I think having that cultural heritage does give a grounding and some depth to the society and to Iraqis themselves. I have a lot of time for Iraqis. They are also entrepreneurial, clever,
Yes. Yeah.
motivated, very warm and hospitable. And I do think a lot of those traits, there is a certain depth that comes from knowing what the culture was at one time, what the society was, and therefore what it
Yes.
maybe could be again. So there's a
Yeah.
pride in that that's understandable. Absolutely fascinating country and really, really wonderful people.
So tell us about the. Let's focus on Iraq because it's a thing that is a challenging story. So tell us about any FDI project or any FDI story from within Iraq and how materialized. mm, What kind of investors went in? What kind of support that's required, whether it's from the US or the Iraqi government? Just what does it take to get a post conflict nation up and attract investment in them?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that yes, there can be issues of security in a post-conflict society, but the bigger problem is usually the nation image is harmed so much. So the feeling, the fear that people have about the security is really off-putting. And sometimes that legacy of having a negative nation brand, as it were, because of a war will last decades even after peace has come. We've seen that in a number of places around the world. So the challenge Iraq had in those years, and I guess still does, is that this investment was needed. There was, on the one hand, a lot of support. The U.S. government was putting a lot of money in, American companies being incentivized to invest. So obviously you saw that in the energy sector, but a lot of investment went into ports and infrastructure, and that's to the benefit now. There were a lot of efforts to clean up the banking sector. There was a big moment kind of at the time that HSBC put a physical, office and branch there in Baghdad. I think around 2010, that was a big message of some sort of endorsement. Um, at the time also there was a big need for, and there still need is a big need for residential, for hotels. One thing I find incredibly fascinating about Iraq is its potential as a tourist destination, and this is where people say, "Ooh, Iraq," because of that legacy of associating only with war. But it's culturally rich, as we discussed. It's a beautiful country. There are sites there. I remember being very struck by visiting Lake Habbanaya, where it had in the 70s been a kind of illustrious resort. And then it was just, there was pockmarked full of bullet holes and had been bombed. But I read an article only a year or two ago that it's now thriving again. It's a resort. People are holidaying there. And that's something really beautiful to see because it's a sign of life coming back, but that also means investment in that facility. So I think there are interesting opportunities that maybe are long overdue from being maximized in Iraq beyond the energy sector. And that would be in housing, in transport infrastructure, interestingly, in tourism, and of course, in agribusiness, because it has a lot of really amazing food products. The best dates in the Middle East. I hope I don't offend any other places by saying that, but I think there's a lot of Iraqi food products that could be sort of leveraged and geared for export with the right investments. So I'm probably not answering in that there wasn't enough impactful investment that happened at the time, but I can see it happening now. And I believe there's a lot of scope for future investment that could make a really big impact.
And in that sense, like, what do you think is the role of multilateral institutions like the World Bank or even the USAID or the Exim Bank in facilitating such investments?
Well, their role is really crucial because of that kind of the guarantees and the security that they can offer. Now, it was always very, delicate in a place like Iraq when when you have, I guess, the invading occupier nation then being the one that bankrolls the reconstruction. On the one hand, yes, the U.S. should bankroll the reconstruction if we were the ones that sort of waged the war, but then it gets very delicate about taking American money, about the over influence of American institutions. But all that said, you can't really do economic reconstruction post conflict without the support of multilateral development banks and agencies. USAID, who I do projects for, does really wonderful work in loads of places around the world, and they do a lot of hard work, useful work in capacity building, really necessary work. And again, I think having international expertise as well as capital is really crucial to developing countries being able to maximize their FDI potential.
No, it's very important, and USAID does work, and you need a kind of an underwriter
That's right.
of risk. So whether it's Exim Bank or a donor or foundation, you need that in a situation like that. Otherwise, private capital would not come in.
That's
I
right.
mean, coming to your topic of being on the other side, do you think, in your view, looking at Iraq and others, post-conflict scenario, if you were to attract FDI, possibly a democratic setup, while desirable, may not be the best in immediately after post-conflict, because there's too much of pull and push and confusion and that kind of thing. And maybe you need some form of, using a military term, unity of command, policy consistency, some kind of policy direction, top down management, especially at that time. And after 10, 20, 30 years, you can definitely get more democratic representation.
That's probably true. And from an ideological perspective, I don't want to agree with you, but from a fully practical perspective, there's for sure something in that, because stability is something that investors require. And instability is obviously a key thing that scares off investors. But of course, there are loads of, in the longer term, who, democracy is desirable, and just from a perspective of people's lives and their wishes, and yes, that probably works better in the long run. But there's a lot of examples of places around the world that have been able to develop quicker because they have that unity of command versus messy democracy. This makes for some uncomfortable conclusions sometimes, but that is the reality. I mean, China is probably the biggest example of this, and the FDI success and the development, because it's very top down. We're seeing it now in places like Saudi, for example. And so where the
Amazing.
government says, this is the path we're on, this is where we're going, this is where we're doing, and everyone knows, yes, that is the path. It can simplify things, even if that's maybe not ideologically what I would personally want to live under. Myself, I would rather be in a democracy, and from an ideological perspective, I kind of want that for everyone. But again, from a pragmatic perspective, it's very hard to argue with the idea that this stability, and sometimes the top down makes it a little bit easier to pursue these development goals. Now, that's assuming that it's a benign top down, and of course there are many cases where that's not the case, and then it has the opposite result.
So for every Lee Kuan Yew, you have an Idi Amin. That's the definitely risk.
Yes.
Someone who's very effective and everything. But if you even look at example of Paul Kagame in Rwanda, excellent story, but not a democratic. I mean, there is a certain direction you have to take, and if you don't, I mean, get caught at the rough end of the stick in that case. And even if you look at Chile, and even if you look at South Korea, fantastic success story last 40, 50 years, but they were tough times that they had in 1970s and 80s. If you had dissent, it would not be liked or appreciated, and you would know about it. But now Chile is the second most democratic country. It's very wealthy in Latin America. South Korea, so their president was daughter of a former dictator. She did something wrong and she was put in jail, and I think she's still in jail. So these countries are developed democratically, but they have also developed economically before then, and I think there is something to be said to that. Do you agree with that generally in your experience across the board where you have attracted FDI? And this purely, I'm speaking from the perspective.
Yes, and probably there's something in the fact that people in the search for stability, including economic stability and economic growth, people, maybe the citizens, are prepared to trade some of the freedom for that. But there comes a time when, once that economic stability has been achieved, you want more than that, right? That doesn't, you don't want to make those trade-offs anymore. And that's why in some cases you will see maybe the path will change, and there will be a sort of more of a push for democracy once those gains have been achieved.
Absolutely. This is what Maslow's hierarchy of human needs was, that you had survival. When you had a very basic survival and this and other, you want direction, stability. But at some point, when that is covered, then you look for self-actualization, freedom, creativity, all of those things. And that is democratic institutions are much more conducive to it. So right. Iraq was an interesting case study that you experienced. And what is it that you're working on now that you're very excited about?
Well, I'm enjoying being, kind of in the sharp end of FDI promotion and working in a new way and in a more direct way. So I worked last year on USAID project with Pakistan. I think our paths crossed in that way as well. And that was really helping to take Pakistani startups that have been identified through a vetting process as having the most potential, taking them on a roadshow. We took them to Dubai. I enjoyed a lot also working with these startups, so going through their pitches with them to fine tune them. We held an extremely successful roadshow in Dubai with a lot of very serious investors. So that I would say I would count as a success, and I was really proud to be part of that. That was a part of USAID's long-term work in Pakistan. I'm now working on another project to help fine-tune and create investment guides for 3 of the provinces. So that's really nice content work and plays, I guess, to my strengths as a former editor, which is how.
Where is that? Where is that?
This is a USAID project where we are working to create investor guides at the provincial level.
For Pakistan.
And so I'm working on that. I've done some enjoyable work with a special economic zone in Angola called Luanda Bingo Special Economic Zone, again, helping them maximize opportunities in the UAE. And one thing I've found is that there is, I've worked a lot in the UAE over the years, and this nexus of, UAE investments in MENAP, but also in sub-Saharan Africa is really an interesting dynamic right now, and I'm enjoying sort of helping facilitate that. So bringing opportunities in African and countries from around MENAP to the UAE to work with big investors there is something that I'm very actively engaged in. But I work also even for cities like the city of Riga in Latvia that's doing a lot of really great work to develop, especially their professional services and tech industries. And something new is that I'm also playing a matchmaking role, because it occurred to me that I tend to know, all the, not all, I know government ministers and the priorities at the governmental level. So what PPP projects are they doing? What are the big state-backed projects? But then I may know, on the other hand, those who would like to come in and be transaction advisors or funders, facilitators, or investors. And I'm kind of playing a matchmaking role there. And that's quite exciting and interesting for me, to try to bridge the gap between potentially investable and bankable projects and funding sources. So I'm quite I guess juggling a lot. One role that I continue that I enjoy a lot is as a senior advisor for the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, which is the global body representing all the investment promotion agencies. And I have a few other clients. I recently joined as a communication advisor for a consultancy called Quadrian that's doing very cool things, bridging the gap between the VC world and special economic zones. So, and I have, of course, my event work, moderating, advising event organizers on content, especially when it comes to investment roadshows and forums. So I'm wearing a lot of hats and juggling a lot of balls, but I'm enjoying it very much. As you probably would have gathered, I'm happy to work anywhere, but my heart is in the emerging markets. So these are the places that interest me the most, but also where the impact is the greatest. And so it's probably a bit more rewarding.
Excellent, and it keeps you on the same journey, also of exploring new ventures and exploring new boundaries. And so
Yeah.
let's get back to this question that I asked you earlier about letting go of your past or your history and to create a new identity. You've done it multiple times. From Birmingham, you went to London. From London, you went to DC. From DC, you came back. You were a small publishing house or media, then you became part of big, and now you're a founder and entrepreneur. It's a constant reinvention and transformation of your identity, of your experience, and constant evolution. So what is the evolution that countries have to go through in order to attract FDI at a massive scale, to become really like an India or a China or a South Korea? In your views, what are those?
Well, I think from a conceptual standpoint, some of that is shedding some of their past that they maybe need to shed, while maintaining pride in legacy that is worth having pride in. So some places, like, people get bogged down in the past and can't really move on from it. So it's
Emerging
very,
markets is full of it. I mean, the good thing about America is that America thinks about the future. It's all about
well,
today and tomorrow, mostly, but
this is
emerging markets all about the past.
this is it. And there's a saying that even in Europe is sort of wears its past very heavily, and the US not
Yes.
having past just doesn't wear that at all. And I think there's
Yeah.
something in that. But a lot of the countries have heritage that is worth maintaining, and having pride in. But for sure, it's about looking at the future. It's about thinking where you want to be. What is the development journey you want to go on, and what are the milestones? But it's really boring, but it all comes down as well to policy. So you have to have the right legal frameworks, you have to write legislative and regulatory frameworks, and that's the stuff that's not very exciting, but that's the real work. And that's where I think there are a lot of heroes at the ground level plodding away without the glory, working on capacity building, working on policy. So I think you have to have this big vision and be able to sell the vision, obviously, to the populace about where you want to go. But you have to do all this hard work and get the buy-in for the policies that are actually going to make your investment environment attractive to investors. And it's all just very easy to say that, but it's not easy at all to do. But stability and security is really important. And this is where a lot of, emerging markets get tripped up. Part of it's getting tripped up by history, but history is what creates ongoing conflict. And then they become a victim of not just the conflict, but the image of instability and insecurity that it creates. And I think a lot of developing countries suffer from an image problem, Now, it doesn't mean there are not real problems,
Mhm.
but when you're thinking about FDI, you're really selling your location. You're selling it like a product. And a lot of countries have a sort of unfairly bad reputation, or branding as a product. And that has to be acknowledged and that has to be confronted at the same time that the real work is also being done to make those realities better. But then you also have to convince the world that those realities are better. And that's where I like to be, I guess, in that space, as a storyteller and as a communicator.
So goes back to what I always say: is it the product is a problem, or is the marketing is a problem? And and FDI, you said it's like a product. I agree with that. And I think when you look at the product, which is the history, the region, the security, the policy, in your view, what would you think are the top three impediments? Is it bureaucracy? Is it lack of commercial private sense in the people? Is it overbearing national security kind of mindset that everything has to go through that screening process? In your view, what, when you look at the product, that what really on the ground that facilitates investment and that kind of turbocharges investment, what in your view are the three biggest obstacles these countries have?
Well, a lot of times it is that protectionism, and you'll have this contradictory situation very often where a government will accept they need FDI and they'll put it as a major objective to attract FDI, but then put in place rigid policies like screenings. And developed countries do this too. We have this right now, going on in the US. But very often you'll say we want FDI, but not so much. And there's a contradiction in saying and in setting out to attract FDI, but putting in policies that are actually impediments to FDI. And you do, like everything, you want to balance. You don't necessarily have to open up every industry. You want to protect what you can. But protectionism is a major problem. Bureaucracy, over an overly heavy state mixed with corruption, and that's a pretty bad combination that's very off-putting for a lot of companies, international companies and investors. And a lot of the protectionism comes from a lack of advocacy. So people that have grown up in complicated societies that are used to instability, maybe even war, of course they want protection, of course they feel threatened, of course they feel maybe even instinctively suspicious of outsiders, including foreign companies. And there's a long history of exploitation in a lot of places in the world, but there's a need for putting enough protection in place that it doesn't allow foreign investors to exploit the local people or the place, but also explaining to people, why it's useful. I'm a big believer in FDI advocacy, like being a cheerleader for its positive possibilities while still guarding against some of its negative sides. And I think very often politicians being politicians, it's just a lot easier to say, no, I'm protecting you from the foreigners and the colonizers than to actually make the case of why this investment is needed. But I
So
appreciate it's not easy.
So you know the history. We have something called the British East India Company, which came as a commercial enterprise and ended up becoming a colonial power. So there is a little lot of that. So when I talk about jettisoning your history and letting it go, letting it rest, and in order to become more markets oriented, more welcoming, I think that's what I'm referring to. So I do agree with that. In terms of the product, that these things that you mentioned, protectionism, and a state of corruption and a heavily overbearing state. We call it the license Raj, which basically means to do everything and anything. You need a bureaucrat to say NOC, no objection certificate, to
Yeah.
do that. And I think that's a big impediment to that. So now that's what the product can make it a not a good product for FDI. In
Mhm.
terms of the story or the story selling, what are the kind of things a country can do to make it an attractive story? Always Asia, Malaysia, those kind of campaigns on CNN. But what else can a country do to make yourself an attractive FDI story?
Well, I think finding what's unique or interesting, telling the story of evolution. So, in a way, you can confront what your past was or what your old image was and show how it's changing, acknowledge it, turn it a bit on its head. it's really good to focus on dynamism, youth, talent, energy, showing that you're a place where things are happening, where energy is moving to. These are the effective stories. Sometimes it is a case of a slogan and a campaign. I mean, the Incredible India campaign was really good, and we all remember that. It was impactful, but it has to be more than just a slogan. It's more about strategic storytelling. So showing your evolution, showing why it's a place to be, showing that there's an energy there, and you create that feeling that you might be missing out on something if you're not getting involved there, if you're not coming into that ecosystem. Tourism is actually a very good lever for changing an
Yes.
image, and it works really well when you can have an effective drive to attract tourists that works in tandem with the nation brand or the FDI storytelling. Because also, if you convince people to come there and then they can see on the ground that maybe their perceptions are out of date, but it also creates that idea that something's happening, that it's a place to be. And I think that can be really powerful in terms of especially changing the image around. We saw that quite effectively used in Colombia. So this is another conflict society where the reputation was a bit unfairly, associated with really negative things, even after some peace was found. There's an idea that it's an extremely dangerous place when it's actually much safer than other places in the region that have higher crime rates. They started bringing journalists in. I was one of them. They were inviting journalists. They were hosting international conferences. They did a huge tourism campaign. And I think that's bearing fruit. There's still work to do because there's still a legacy of negative association, but I think they're working really hard to turn that on its head and having some success doing that.
And of course, Colombia had a bad rep because of FARC and all the instability
Yeah.
that happened. It was not too long ago. I mean, we are talking about a decade old kind
Yes.
of war that lasted for a long time that has been settled. So I think that's
Yeah.
very interesting. And you said that they use, and it's a hugely, richly cultural,
That's
both in terms of landscape, food, culture, everything, that kind of story. So,
yeah.
so you think, so what you're saying is that soft power is a very effective tool in attracting FDI, because all the things you've talked about, India, dancing, Bollywood, all of those things that
Mhm.
gets you attracted, and that culture, and then investment comes on the back of it. Do you believe that the people first connect at a personal level, maybe cultural level? People have to like you to invest in you, and it's just not, hey, I can get a 30-40% IRR on a project. Let me go invest in a country I really don't like.
Well, actually, I think it can work both ways. I do think soft power can be leveraged, and it can really be utilized to the benefit of FDI. That said, where the business case is so strong and so compelling and so powerful, you almost don't need that. And again, I would probably point to China as an example there. It became at a certain point a no brainer that you had to have some kind of facility there. You had to engage with the Chinese economy. It doesn't mean that there was no soft power employed, but that's not what they were leveraging or what they were trading on. But many other places, I think, could benefit from it, can use it, and it can just you can't sort of just rely on soft power, but it's just part of the mix, another tool at your disposal to try to create a better image, to try to gain some momentum, and to try to attract some interest.
And so this is very interesting that you talked about China. I think the compelling story of China was for a long period of time. There are a lot of internal investment also, but there are also some compelling advantages in manufacturing that you just simply cannot ignore if you're a world-class manufacturer. But how
That's
do you compare the FDI story of China versus India? Who would you think did a better job or has a better outcome even now or in the long run?
it's a really dangerous game to compare these two places, but I would say, first of all, I wouldn't say it has to be an either or. I think they
Yes.
are two economies that cannot be ignored, two markets that can't be annoyed, and any major multinational company has got to have a strategy for both. But what I would say is that in the recent decades, we all know that the Chinese growth story, it became an essential place, that the business case spoke for itself, that you sort of had to be there. That Other places are catching up. India lagged behind because some of it is what we spoke about already, which is the messy democracy versus the kind of top down leadership. It was just harder for India to be on that same path that China was on. But in recent years, we've seen India close the gap and actually overtake. And the FDI momentum is very much with India at the moment. A lot of that was, um, the sort of Modi was a very good FDI governor, and kind of brought that credibility, but also brought that spirit of business reform and that big focus on FDI to the national level. And I'm not getting into politics or weighing up merits of anything like that, but just strictly from an FDI
Yeah.
perspective, it has been successful. Invest India also does a very good job as an investment promotion agency. Again, and I think we could even kind of tie it back to the nation branding work that was done with Incredible India. So you have this confluence of factors where it's already a big, important country, a big workforce with good skills, cost competitiveness, all that stuff. You had that in the mix. The big downside was the business environment was considered completely off-putting. But once you have some reforms in that, once you have a reform-minded government with some good FDI
Justified. Yeah.
credentials, combined with good storytelling, a good investment promotion agency, that has created this current FDI momentum that we see with India.
So that's very interesting that all of these things kind of came together and may have come together last 10 years.
Yeah.
And that soft power as well as the core economics worked in favor of India. India, of course, had a huge bureaucratic legacy that they have reformed since the 1990s. But yet, foreign direct investors in 2000 had a bad time in India. They were not able to get their money back. Lots of hanky-panky happened with local sponsors, as you know. But I think over a period of time, the reforms took place. The level playing field was made, and as a result, the money has now flown in, and now a lot of large institutional investors, Blackstones and others, are all present in India. So I think that's a fantastic story, and it's a story of both change of culture from being, we used to call the license Raj is actually an Indian term. So the bureaucratic is an Indian term. They managed to loosen it. The politics has improved, the reform, the commercial performance or ethics and governance has improved. And hence, as you said, Indian FDI has taken over China. So I think that's a very interesting case study. Is there any other learning from India that you think you have? Any other insight?
Well, I think it obviously is a testament to the importance of talent and workforce, because the big draw to India originally as an FDI destination was the tech workforce. And you sort of have to have good education. You have to have the right systems in place to create a workforce that it wasn't just about volume or quantity. It was this sort of quality at a cost-effective rate that was a bit lightning in a bottle for India, and especially in terms of its tech talent. And sort of looking at sort of a neighbor, I think this is something that Pakistan is looking to do and has the capability to do, because actually the sort of tech talent, the workforce in Pakistan is also very strong. And I know that this is a big focus of efforts there to try to sort of leverage some of the capabilities in tech and leverage this youthful, large, talented workforce. So I think that's another lesson I would take from India.
So this is the FDI, and I think let's segue into Pakistan, given that what you're working on. The FDI story for Pakistan is not pretty. I think it's the fact that we are in a very difficult part of the world, Iran and Afghanistan and all those things. But we have also not done favors to ourselves in terms of the policy consistency, the policy changes, the governance, and all of those things changes. So you've looked at Pakistan. What are the top three things that you would recommend, let's say on the product, let's put the story side later, on the product side, how can Pakistan change to improve the product offering of FDI investment?
Well, I think at the bigger level, one thing that impacts the ultimate FDI product is the instability in the political environment, because it's very hard to have policy stability and to move sort of in a unified, useful direction in terms of FDI policy when there is political chaos. So that actually impacts the FDI product, but of course it also impacts the image, which is just something you can't ignore when you think about Pakistan as an FDI destination. The image is probably one of the biggest problems. In the product, I know there's been a lot of effort, there have been reforms, and it's just a case of trying to stay on a reform path. But again, I think that the impediment to staying on a reform path is the political instability, and that has to somehow be solved, which of course is easier said than done.
Yes, and you think Pakistan has, because if you look at the numbers, whether it's 2 billion or 3 billion, these are peanuts like compared to India and other places which attract about 50 billion, or even Turkey. I mean, Turkey is a fantastic example, even though it is going through a very tough economic and as well as political times, it still attracts a lot of FDI. So what is it? And Pakistan is a country of scale, 220 million people. So
Mhm.
other than the instability, is there things that you have noticed, or maybe something you're working on, which is on the side of the business groups, the business families, the counterparts? Because FDI needs a counterpart, a commercial counterpart to an FDI investor. So sometimes you have that counterpart, sometimes you don't have that counterpart, or you don't have the right one. So do you feel that there is that could also be the case, or any other reason you think that Pakistan's FDI history, or in terms of product development that we've had, has not delivered to what its potential should be?
Well, I guess, yeah, yes, I can answer that with maybe a caveat that I'm not sort of working on advising on the policy or the capacity building. It's more around the outreach,
Mhm.
and other types of support. So I want to stay in my lane, as it were. But I think there's an absence of some of those national champions, and that in India there are a lot of powerful companies that developed and that had success on the world stage, and everyone knows them, and that can be a counterpart in the sense that that brings customers, suppliers, partners. Pakistan is probably lacking that, so
Yeah.
you would really struggle to think of national champions. I would say, their successes, like Kareem, the ride hailing app is one that you can kind of point to, but probably, and this is the flip side of the coin of FDI, is usually what's good for FDI is also good for developing your domestic industry. And if you really want economic stability, you don't want to rely wholly on either. You want to have a healthy mix of strong FDI inflows and productive FDI. I would say the right kind of FDI coming in. But of course, you also want to develop your own entrepreneurial ecosystems. And that's why that's currently a big focus of some of the economic development work being done in Pakistan. But you also need to have a conducive environment for your own domestic companies to succeed. And there clearly are companies that are succeeding there, but I would say that's probably where there's a bit of a gap, because also that helps with giving some recognition and feeling of certainty for international companies as well. If they can look at domestic companies that have made it, that again look to them like proper suppliers or partners or customers.
So, I think it's very interesting because I've also done private equity in emerging markets. And I always say the biggest risk in emerging market investment is counterparty risk.
Hmm.
It's like, because these markets are growing, you will have an opportunity. If you're long enough, 7 to 10 years, you're always doing money. But to have the right counterparty, which is your right local partner, that is critical. And I
Yeah.
do think that I'm referring to the Ambani wedding recently. In India, you saw that everyone from Elon Musk to Zuckerberg, everyone was there. So that
Yeah.
basically showed that the businesses, the commercial people, and not just the government, have the heft to both be counterparts and to pull in large scale investors into India. And I think that's a big advantage. And I'm very pleased that you mentioned it, that level of national champions, I think they are missing in Pakistan.
Yeah. But again, I guess to take a more optimistic slant, as I mentioned, any improvements that would make the environment better for foreign investors, if done properly, should also make the environment better for domestic companies, and therefore should, in theory, be a win-win.
No, excellent. And I think I'm a big of that in order to both export as well as attract, you need to have a strong domestic to do that. So I think
Yeah.
that's very, very interesting example that you have talked about both India, China, as well as Pakistan. Another very successful and very interesting example is Vietnam, which has done a
Yes.
fantastic job. I mean, Vietnam was a communist country. And up to 20, 25 years ago, it was not doing very well. It has a
That's right.
legacy, but it has attracted a lot of capital. It has played the great game. So the other between China and the USA rather well. So do you have any insights about Vietnam's capital FDI attraction strategy, and also to talk about this trade game that is now happening between China and the US? A lot of countries, including Pakistan, are getting caught in the middle of how do you balance the two out together. So, like, how do you navigate in such times? But
Well,
starting
yeah,
from
Vietnam is a very clear recent FDI success story, and that is a result of, again, an incredibly good workforce, good policy, a dedicated sort of effort, a good strategy, and a strategic approach to where they wanted the economy to go, but also clearly benefited from, if not a shift away from China, a move away from a China only to a China plus one or China plus multiple countries approach. They were just right there, ready to sort of poised to benefit from that, but have played a good sort of diplomatic hand in that sort of rivalry between the US and China. So it's a bit of a master class, actually, in how to do that.
yeah. And they've played that very well, even though they are in a very kind of tricky situation,
Yeah.
South China Sea and all of those things. So they've done that. So do you think that there was because they had a very compelling business case, or they had good political leadership, or the leadership that they have?
I think it was a combination. I think there was a little bit of an opportune moment, but you have to have done put a few pieces in place in order to capitalize on a certain moment. So I
Yeah.
think they had a good leadership in terms of the sort of economic trajectory and the FDI policy and the FDI approach. So when there was a kind of diversification suddenly of supply chains and of manufacturing hubs, they were well placed to take advantage of that, but also were willing to do that. So I think it's not just one or the other, it's multiple factors.
Excellent. So that's a very interesting case study of, and a lot of it is around human talent. I think what you've mentioned, both in case of China, but in case of India as well as Vietnam, that is around which you build a sustained competitive advantage.
Mhm.
And without that, you can attract it, but not in the long term basis. And then you have to have strategic focus approach and a policy consistency. So
That's
what
right.
is so you think for your own venture, FD Finger Direct Investing, you think that there is a scope in FDI? You talked about advocacy, so maybe an FDI communications agency that just focuses on advising governments. I'm sure you're doing that, but like a very bespoke, very specialized agency that helps governments mold their story in that respect.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, a kind of core part of what I'm doing. And I would say that there are a lot of FDI experts who I respect a lot, and everyone, I think there's enough room in the market for the different types of expertise. Maybe what I bring that's a little bit unique is this experience and background as a journalist. So from a communication standpoint, that's where I think I can really help, and I hope to help and hope to play a role.
And so tell us, like, who are the people that when they're thinking about FDI should reach out to you? These are government departments or companies looking to invest, seeking advice of different countries, and why and who should be the people to getting in touch for those purposes?
Well, I guess the different groups would be the classic one would be an investment promotion agency that could be
Okay.
at a city, regional, or national level who needs some assistance again in their storytelling and taking their message to the world, but also on kind of investor outreach and running investor roadshows. Um, but also the ministries who have big state-backed projects where they need to engage international investors, but also transaction advisors and so on. And then on the other side, companies that want to access emerging markets where you really need to know who to talk to and how the landscape is. So companies looking to access opportunities and maybe more difficult, especially frontier markets. I'm working with a few of those as well. So I would say those would be my groups.
Excellent. And these are all big transactions you're talking about. I think one thing that you mentioned, Pakistan does have a lot of public-private partnerships that are going
Yes,
on in infrastructure and healthcare, and a lot of times the capabilities are not within the country, both in terms
that's
of capital but also in service delivery. So I think that's a very interesting area, and the huge projects are all across the world where I think matchmaking and giving them advice, bringing the right partners could be very, very useful. And then, there is
yes.
always some kind of communication challenge that is around these projects, environmental or otherwise, and you need to have a good communication strategy around them.
That's right.
Looking into the future, what are the challenges to FDI that you feel there is a rise of protectionism, going back into your hinterland, going back to your home country, or kind of getting businesses back in, hunkering down. There is a trend that is happening across the world. So, what are the
Mhm.
2, 3 top challenges you talk about to FDI that you see in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, the protectionism is a clear challenge, and this is linked to rising nationalism and this sort of insularity and populist movements that we've seen in many places in the world. So that is creating a difficult geopolitical environment. But also, geopolitical instability is having a knock-on effect on global FDI flows. So essentially, the post-COVID momentum got essentially halted by inflation, by protectionism, and by geopolitical instability. And we're not out of the woods yet completely with any of those things. So that makes me still a little bit tepid in what I would expect to see in the next year or two in FDI. But there are opportunities because we're seeing major shifts in global value chains, and that creates an opportunity for countries to find a new place as these puzzle pieces move around. They may be able to establish themselves in a slightly better spot on the map. So there's still a lot to play for, but I expect that it's going to continue to be globally a very challenging environment for FDI for the next little while.
Absolutely. And but do you think things like the trends like semiconductors, their manufacturing, because then you're talking about huge amount of capital. You cannot set up a semiconductor plant everywhere. I mean, it's not possible. So those countries can benefit from that. Do you think that trend will, help FDI directed towards certain countries?
Yes, but I guess the caveat is only to certain countries, so not everyone can compete for that, but for those
Mhm.
places that can, there's certainly things to benefit from there, and that's where always, even in uncertainty and a bit of chaos, you will always still have some winners emerge, and you can still capitalize on the opportunities that do exist, but I would say the path is still plagued with a lot of potholes, over the next year or 2.
Excellent. But nonetheless, it was a fantastic story that we got from Alabama, from Birmingham, Alabama to London, back to DC, Edinburgh, London, and then to Iraq, to Pakistan, to India, to China, as well as Vietnam. And it was fantastic to have a very personalized view of FDI. What are the challenges? And I think what we got from the inside that there's a product. You have to get the product right. Getting the story right is half of it, and that product, getting the product right means that you need to have a core competitive advantage, which is around the people. Whether it's China, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's India, or even Indonesia, build up good talent, good workforce, either in pharmaceutical or tech or manufacturing, around which The competitive advantage was built for countries to attract FDI, to then export, and to become economic powers. So I think we have had a very fascinating, very interesting discussion with Courtney. Thank you very much for your time. And Courtney, any last thoughts about your next thing and what you would like to do, and your hopes and your aspirations for both FDI, the company, and FDI as attracting investment?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. For FDI in general, my hope is that some of these detriments that are pulling down global FDI flows, the nationalism, the protectionism, the geopolitical instability, I'm hoping that these things will improve and reduce in time, not only because they're dangerous things in their own right, but the impact that they have on global trade and investment. My dearest hope would be that those things calm down, and we'll be watching certain election results very carefully to see if that might be the case. For my own business, I'm glad to be working in this industry. I enjoy very much helping locations sort of identify their strong points for FDI, to maximize those strong points and to communicate those strong points. And I would just encourage any sort of investment promotion agencies or ministries or so on who are struggling with that to maybe reach out to me and to see if we can kind of help turn your story around, because I really enjoy doing that. It's my great passion in life.
And I think there's something to say about someone who dedicates their day in, day out profession, career, personal thought, mind space, and time space to a certain area, which is FDI in your case. And the level of expertise is very nuanced. You may think it is generalist information or knowledge, but it's not. It's very nuanced. Everything has much more complexity. Every situation is very customized. And so having experts like yourself who have done 20, 25 years of work in this area, both as a researcher, reporter, editor, and now as a practitioner, I think is very important for companies to bear down and to benefit from your advantage. So with that, we come to an end of another very fascinating topic of FDI, the transformation of countries through FDI. How do they improve their product, who they are as people, as countries, as governments, and then their story, who they appear, and what is their narrative to others. And I think in building a good FDI story, you need both the good product and as well as a good story. And I think we learned a lot about what it takes for Vietnam, for India, for China to attract FDI, and for you, if you're a country attracting it. There are a lot of lessons from what Courtney has discussed and on this podcast. So do join us on the next podcast, and also subscribe to the Alchemy of Transformation podcast on YouTube and on other social media channels. Thank you for joining us today, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.